Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion sponsored by HighByte, featuring technology and analytics leaders who, over the next hour, will share with you their thoughts on emerging trends in data architecture, challenges and pitfalls, and best practices to consider for life sciences 4.0. My name is Ryan Martin, Research Director at ABI Research, and I lead the industrial and manufacturing practice at ABI Research. I'm joined today by John Patanian, Data Analytics Manager at Alcon, an $8 billion pharmaceutical and medical device company specializing in eye care products like contact lenses. Chris Demers, Global Lead of Plant Data and Analytics for Catalent, a $5 billion contract development manufacturing partner for personalized medicine, drugs, and consumer brands. And John Harrington, Chief Product Officer at HighByte, a leading industrial software development partner specializing in data ops for Industry 4.0, in our case today, Life Sciences 4.0. Today's setting is interactive, so we encourage those of you listening live to submit any questions you have to our Q&A registration form as they spring to mind, and our panelists will try to get to those in real time or just in the chat box. We'll also take a few moments near the end to answer your questions submitted, and those that we don't get to in time, we can follow up on after to address. So the point is, if you have questions, please go ahead and ask, and we'll try to incorporate it into the conversation. So with that housekeeping squared away, I'd like to frame the discussion with a few megatrends first, and then turn it to our panels, who are the real stars of today's conversation. The first megatrend is electrification. This is electrification of end products from consumer devices to vehicles we ride in, the whole transportation industry, and increasingly this applies to more than just vehicles. Today, roughly 9% of all vehicles shipped are EVs, and about half of car sales will be electric by 2030. But we can think of the implications downstream into everything that goes into those vehicles and everything that they're connected to. Electrification is important because it begets intelligence, and this plays into the network effect in a pretty big way. Intelligence also plays into autonomy, and autonomy is really changing our expectations around optimization. And in this case, the relevance is software. So software is driving a lot of the optimizations and autonomy, not just in the end products, but also in the processes that make those products. Digital twin, and digital twin is really about data continuity and coherence within and across teams. Industry 4.0 and Life Sciences 4.0 is all about data. Typically, we have multiple factions that all benefit from an integrated perspective into the same business areas, but with a slightly different lens relevant to each operator, and this is one capability that digital twin solutions enable. This matters for several reasons, but one is that if you're in IT, typically you're looking at optimization of data and therefore maybe a little bit warmer to things like cloud. OT, you're probably focused at the edge or shop floor data, and then ET, engineering technology professionals, are looking at something in between. So digital twin and digital thread unify that data story for a more informed, actionable decision-making overall. Fourth area is collaboration. And as you may notice, not all of these are really technologies, but as I mentioned, trends, and collaboration changed in a really big way the last few years, in particular when folks were forced off-site and they still need to collaborate and be productive. And now, so of course that means cloud, but really if anything, it's finding the right balance between edge and cloud, something that we'll talk about here today. Fifth area is sustainability. Sustainability is not going anywhere, not going away anytime soon, and it means many different things to many different companies. And the four previously mentioned megatrends very much tie into sustainability, as well as this last area, which is as a service. So as a service is business model transformation, it's supplier transformation, ecosystem transformation, new marketplaces, and new operating models. So with that, I would like to now turn it over to our panelists for more proper introductions and to discuss the topic at hand. Stop sharing this. We can see everyone in full. And with that, I'd like to start with maybe John, if you could please describe your experience, your current role, responsibilities, what department you're in, what you're working on now. And so John, if you could do that, then we'll go to Chris and then John Harrington.
Okay, sounds good. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity. I work for Alcon, which is a vision care company, as Ryan mentioned. past experience, I spent about 25 years outside of life sciences working for GE Power, a mechanical engineering background. Mid-career, I went back and got a computer science degree and applied that the last 10 years or so at GE doing industrial analytics. One was first for helping to plan maintenance outages, what work happened during those outages. And then the last 5 years or so, I worked at a monitoring and diagnostic center that was monitoring about 2,500 to 3,000 pieces of power generation equipment, real time, really trying to keep availability as high as possible. Current role, the last 3 years or so at Alcon, I'm a data and analytics manager at one of our manufacturing sites. Overall, Alcon has a vision care division as well as a surgical division. Vision care would be like contact lenses and solutions, something like Systane that you might see at your local pharmacy. And surgical, really the customers there are really the eye surgeons. So things like stuff for surgery, medical inspection devices, as well as intraocular lenses. Right now, I work at one of our contact lens manufacturing sites, which is a very high volume automated manufacturing environment. I'm serving as a kind of a de facto Industry 4.0 leader for the site, as well as being like a pilot for the company in terms of Industry 4.0 implementations. The department I am in is called Manufacturing Sciences and Technology. And so a little bit of a hybrid. They act as a go-between between R&D and manufacturing. So we're not involved in day-to-day operations on the manufacturing floor. However, the group has functions such as doing continuous process monitoring of our product quality attributes. There's a group of process engineers who really are subject matter experts on the process of producing a contact lens, and they're continually involved in projects for optimizing that, as well as the tech transfer pieces in that group as well. So I'm responsible for both, I guess, setting up and maintaining infrastructure, as well as I get involved in individual use cases during implementation. I guess what we're focusing on short term, three general areas. One is real-time visibility, use cases around predictive maintenance, and then individual use cases around trying to optimize the process and improve yield.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, John. Chris.
Thanks. I'm Chris Demers. I've got a PhD in biomedical engineering, heading down sort of the academic career path, did a postdoc at the Francis Crick Institute in London. And that's where I first started becoming obsessed with automation, because here you have this building that The Guardian described as a cathedral to science, and it was filled with all these brilliant people who would basically spend their nights and weekends being glorified liquid handlers. And so I changed industry, moved to a company called Lonza, and lo and behold, we're doing the exact same thing. I'm doing a lot of liquid handling and manually transcribing data. And so taught myself sort of coding, kind of fell into automation engineering, surrounded myself with all these really great automation engineers, and then moved to a role at Catalent, where I am right now, basically as global lead for plant data analytics. So I look after things like basically making fully digital plants. How do we deal with all of our data that we generate? How do we put it in a format that is easily consumed by end users like MSAT or like lab teams? And that's basically what we're working on now. So starting with our non-GMP process development labs, how do we connect up all of our instruments and get it into a single location where nobody has to be manually transcribing data, and you can just run a sample and pull those results in immediately.
Yikes, sounds like a piece of cake, right? John Harrington, last but not least.
Thanks, Ryan. And thanks, Chris and John, for joining us. Yeah, so I'm the Chief Product Officer at HighByte. I've spent my entire career working at the intersection of manufacturing companies and technology. Spent a number of years in software companies and then went and worked in a manufacturing plant, implementing technology, and then got back onto the technology side. So, the last 5 years have been with HighByte. I was a co-founder of HighByte. Prior to that, myself and the other two co-founders had been at Kepware Technologies. I've been there for 8 years. Kepware was acquired by PTC. We then, after a little while, formed HighByte. My focus has always been in kind of really understanding the customer challenges and then communicating with the engineering team on how to best solve these challenges. So really on product management and customer interaction. So at HighByte, it's really focused on that and how we can work with guys like Chris and John to help them drive efficiencies within their own businesses.
I love it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Excited to really dive in. Maybe, John, sticking with you, what does life sciences 4.0 mean to you, and where are we in the journey? So if you just think of the difference between 3.0 and 4.0, or some of the qualities, ground us in the reality of the current situation.
Yeah, so what we see, maybe if I take a step back into 3.0 and I step out of life sciences and look at industry, and then finish with how life sciences is unique. Industry 3.0 was very much about automating. It's about automation. How do we automate the factory? How do we automate a process? And we have the tools for the operations team to automate those processes. Industry 4.0 we see is about leveraging data and leveraging data from that automation, as well as from other systems, and leveraging it both within the operations team, but very much outside of the operations team as well. So across the enterprise, how can we use this industrial data of what's going on in the factory? How efficient is it? What's the yield? What's the quality? What's the supply chain implications? What's the sustainability implications to really drive business value for the company? So it's about leveraging that data, delivering it to the business teams within the company, whether they're working in the plant, the OT team, or whether they're outside of the plant, and even in some cases, customers or vendors, and being able to deliver them the data. When it comes to life sciences is very similar to all the other manufacturing type of disciplines, except that they have, the big challenge is their products have massive impact on human life. And so there's a lot of regulation around it. And so there are a number of challenges with regards to implementing technology. I'm sure that Chris and John can talk much more at length in all these challenges, but it's trying to get really creative as to how do we fit within this regulatory and business challenges, as well as they have some unique systems. So how can we work with those unique systems to be able to, again, deliver business value to the companies?
So what I'm hearing is that this is all about data. And maybe John, Pete, love to go to you to hear about your data perspective in two aspects to this. What is, I guess for you, what is industrial data ops, and how did that conversation start? And then the other aspect is what are you thinking about when it comes to your data architecture and how that can scale?
Sure, I would say, yeah, industrial data ops is really, to me, about getting data as close as possible in a format that's ready to consume. I guess one of the steps on the journey is, if I say look back 3 years ago, right when I started with Alcon, we were doing individual use cases or individual applications, and there were two where we had I would say, early wins, but in reality, they took us probably a year or two to implement. And we came to the realization that we could keep going along that path and do one or two things a year. But in order for us to scale up, we needed to put in some infrastructure, from some data infrastructure, so that at least 50% of each new application wasn't about doing an integration and how to get the data into the application for the specific use case that I was trying to solve. Now, at that same time, I couldn't say, okay, I'm going to take a break from solving any problems and work on data infrastructure for 2 years. How do I, keep agile, still solving problems while incrementally building up my data infrastructure? So I guess, the individual use cases, I view that as kind of the walk phase, the ability to solve problems, but really having a difficult time scaling. And if I think about full maturity, it's like, it's probably the point where the end users of the data, like 80% of the problems they can solve themselves. It's really about enabling them. The manufacturing engineers, process engineers, frontline operations, enabling them to solve the majority of the problems themselves, and having my team tackle the harder problems, maybe where you need to pull in some data science combined with subject matter expertise. So that's kind of the vision.
So on a scale up to 100, how close are we to that vision?
We're still early. I would say I'll give myself some credit and say not 0, but say maybe 30 to 40.
So we're making progress, and that maybe is a good way for us to start talking about UNS. Chris, so this is for you. What is UNS? How can it be achieved, used?
Yeah, so for me, the unified namespace, and John Harrington's got a great way of describing this too. But it's really about internally, I'll describe it as a data marketplace, but it's the structure of your business and like a single location where all of your systems can exchange data and information. And for us, a lot of times that is an MQTT broker, something that's open, lightweight, report by exception. And the structure is ISA 95, because at the end of the day, we are a manufacturer and it lends itself nicely to manufacturing equipment. And then I was just watching a webinar earlier with my friend Jeff Nepper, and he said, unified namespace is also a strategy. So sometimes I forget about that. It doesn't necessarily need to be an MQTT broker. It could be AMQP. It could be anything. It's more about a mindset of like, how do you approach this problem of I've got all these systems that need to exchange data information, and I'm not going to do point to point because that's never going to work. So how do we build this common architecture, this common marketplace for all these things to exchange information?
What does that look like for you?
Yeah, so for us, like I said, it's primarily an MQTT broker, and that's at the core, really. That is our unified namespace. And on the input side, we're heavily leveraging data ops tools like HighByte to contextualize that data, get that data into the ISA 95 format as close to the edge as possible.
And what's that process like? Is it like an overnight kind of thing? You're done, right? Everything's working perfectly now?
That's right. Yeah. It's a slow iterative process. I mean, we like to try to stay agile, but ultimately it boils down to you got to do the integration, you got to connect to something, you got to model the data, and then you got to publish it to various endpoints. One of those might be our broker, our unified namespace. Or we might take some information and publish it directly into a data lake. Maybe we've got an analytic or some sort of dashboard that we're publishing to. But ultimately, the goal is to eliminate all these point-to-point connections and try to move away from that traditional approach.
So Chris, I want to stick with you for a minute and then go over to John P. The question is, how do you think about and justify the ROI for these kinds of projects?
Sorry, I'm just okay. Just cost justification. So for us, the business case that we've been building is, like I said, our major focus right now is about connectivity in our labs. And we've quantified the amount of time the lab currently spends manually transcribing things. Like for example, I take a sample from a bioreactor, I look at an HMI and I record that value. Then I walk it over to some other piece of equipment, look at the HMI and record that value. And this is what bothered me the most when I was working in the labs at Lonza is I was doing all this transcription and I said, like, these are all digital systems. Why am I transcribing this when we could just move that data from A to B? And so we did a sort of cheap and cheerful way of using Excel when we were at Lonza, and now we're doing a much more sophisticated way of, grabbing that data using HighByte and publishing it into the unified namespace. So for us, it's about eliminating that non-value added time. Like if I go back to my Francis Crick Institute example, like here we have all these, and we had the same thing at Catalent, all these highly educated PhD level, master's level people who we are paying them to do all this non-value added work, which is transcription, when we could in reality be focused on things that humans are really good at, which is critical thinking and problem solving. And so if I can close that gap of like, let's eliminate this transcription layer, and that's huge value for us, because now we can, not only do you eliminate that, but you can focus on other things to generate more value for the company. So it's really hard to quantify that exact return on investment, because the potential of eliminating that time savings is huge if they can then focus on other aspects of the business.
Yeah, that's great context. And I would imagine these are probably similar experiences and challenges shared by other companies as well. John P., does this resonate with you? And more specifically to wondering how you're thinking about ROI for digital infrastructure, and particularly how solutions like HighByte Intelligence Hub fit into your context?
Sure. So, I go through a periodic funding cycle as well, where, what our approach is really we're tying the investment in infrastructure with other KPIs that the plant measures itself on. So, for example, one of the things that we do in developing a funding request is say we need funding to put in this infrastructure. Along with that, we're going to develop these X, say 10 number of use cases that are going to save us, I'll make this up, 1% on OE, or we're going to increase OEE by 1%. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is really, can we reduce costs for some of the inputs into the manufacturing process through an optimization, like say improving yield. And then the third piece of that is similar to what Chris said along the productivity. Can you make things more efficient so that people can focus on more value added stuff as opposed to either manually transcribing data or, having to walk across the manufacturing floor to get information from two different pieces of equipment. That's those three areas are what, how I'm justifying the infrastructure investment. And HighByte specifically, we're using, one of the use cases, we're using it to model inputs that we're passing to a predictive maintenance application that's a SaaS application in the cloud.
And so if we're thinking about what you're working on right now, and maybe we can kind of go down the line here, John, sticking with you, then Chris, and then John Harrington. What is the biggest challenge you face in all of that?
Yeah, some of it is inertia. I would say working in a highly regulated environment does have challenges. So there's a lot of, I mean, in one respect, many of the things that get enforced with say full validation of a system follow along the lines of good engineering practices. However, I say like in some cases the focus on documentation is the piece that's can be a big consumption of time in implementing a system. I think the other challenge that I'll mention is making sure like the change management piece is huge in getting adoption of any of the things we roll out. Really, I would say a whole initiative is not necessarily a technology first approach. It's a people first with technology as the supporting backbone to enable the people to solve problems. I guess, yeah, I'll take a break there.
Yeah, it sounds like it's whatever you're offering is only so useful as long as people are using it. Chris, what's the receptivity look like on your end for the solutions that you guys are deploying? And then also, what are your biggest challenges? Are they resonant, different?
I think certainly the socialization is the same for us. That's, I think, a big part of the success or failure of a project is getting people on board, making people believe in your vision, and getting results early enough so that people can see a tangible outcome so that they can say, oh, this is actually worth my time and effort. I would say as far as challenges go, we've got similar challenges to other verticals. I mean, the amount of time it takes us to spin up a virtual machine or work with IT is too long, but I don't think that that's anything unique. Access to different systems is tricky sometimes, working with multiple sites and multiple historians. But yeah, I don't think that's necessarily unique to life sciences. A lot of times the documentation gets in the way, and I think, we've got various strategies to overcome that as well.
What are some of those?
So I think for me, a lot of it comes down to segregating your problems. Like, you've got your validated GMP systems that you can keep them in a validated state, but a lot of times our use cases, you don't necessarily need to validate all aspects of those pieces. Like most of our use cases, you can have sort of non-GMP, non-validated data. And there's a lot of value just in that. If you come up with a metric that directly impacts a product, then you go through the rigor of validating. A lot of times validation just comes down to the, you could have to convince yourself that the tool is doing what it tells you it's doing. Because at the end of the day, you've said it correctly. Ultimately, these products are destined for patients, so we can't make any mistakes.
Yeah, great perspective, and true for a lot of products. In fact, John Harrington, what questions is HighByte getting most, and why do you think those questions are coming to you most?
When it comes to challenges that we're seeing and then the questions around them, I think a key area is similar to what Chris had talked about. Customers want to be more agile, and they want to use information more effectively, and they want to drive their businesses. However, there's all these constraints, and Chris talked about IT, and they've got processes in place. So when you're deploying systems, new systems, you need to work within their environment and figuring out how to work within their environment. They've got tools to monitor, they've got tools to deploy, they've got tools to leverage data. So how can we work within those environments beyond the IT? So you need to satisfy them. At the same time, as Chris had talked about, you've got scalability challenges, and how can we scale out, across multiple machines within a plant? How can we scale out across multiple plants, which have different systems, different deployments, different teams, different needs? And we're often involved in that, in driving scalability, because these projects, similar to what John was talking about, if it's a linear scale, so to do the next project, it costs the same amount as the first one. To do the next one, it costs the same amount. They can't cost justify. You need to drive, economies of scale with these projects. You set it up once, you establish there's some cost in that, but then each additional machine, each additional plant has some incremental cost, but it needs to be significantly less. So how can we drive that, and how can we drive the value? So, we see big challenges around scalability. And then to Chris's point around life sciences, there's this whole agility challenge of the regulatory constraints are, we need to control the process very closely. But analytics is all about agile, and I get some data, I learn from that data, and then I ask new questions, or I want more data. And so it's a very agile and iterative process. And I think technology today allows you to solve both problems. It allows you to have very structured and regulated systems and validated systems for control of the process, but then to provide team members with access to data in a much more agile way, so that they can learn, they can better understand what's going on. They get this really high resolution data. As Chris was talking about earlier, this whole manual collection of data, not only is it potentially error prone, and is it crazy that we're doing it, and it's costly because it's a person doing it. And of course we can't hire people today because it's the labor market is the way it is. But it's also, you only get that data set maybe once a day or once every hour. And with technology, we can collect it every second. And just the things that we can learn about how things are growing, about how things are evolving in the life sciences space, about how machines are operating, is just so much greater when we can collect data automatically and at high resolution. So, those are the challenges that our customers are facing, and we're working with them to solve them, and we're constantly thinking about new ways of doing that.
Chris, I saw you came off mute, so I want to give you a chance to respond if you had some.
No, I mean, yeah, I mean, obviously John's spot on. I think of a use case I literally did last week where it comes down to this scale issue. And in the lab, we've got these small scale bioreactors. So on the floor, in the manufacturing space, they might have, a couple of lines that they have to monitor. So you model a unit operation there. It doesn't really take an automation engineer that long. Well, in the lab, I've got 48 lines. Basically, I've got 48 little bioreactors, but they all have 100 tags. How do an automation person, if you're going to map every single tag, if you're going to model all that data one by one, it would take forever. But, with a tool like HighByte, I did it in the matter of, an hour. I had modeled 24 bioreactors, basically, because you can templatize it. And then because they've got the exact same system at another site, I can just deploy that exact same model, and I can, map all the bioreactors in it. The time delta gets smaller and smaller for me to then deploy this to other sites. So I think that absolutely solves that issue that we're having.
Yeah, John P., are you seeing similar? Like, what are your experiences in terms of challenges cutting through some of the noise and using the tools that are available to you?
Yeah, I would share a similar experience to Chris, and specifically with HighByte, is that we used it to kind of replace a homegrown system that we were using for, I guess, passing data to another application, and just the experience of, for us, we had 17 manufacturing lines, but each manufacturing line has thousands of motors and pneumatic cylinders. Like the ability to templatize stuff and without having to do individual mapping was huge in terms of productivity. It would have taken me months to manually map all those tags. So that's a huge thing, is really just in general being able to have reusability among any of the tools is a big deal. And one of the things that I guess still becomes a challenge is really portability of asset models. One of the things that I'm even currently having to do that's a challenge is I have my UNS asset model, but I have other applications that aren't mature enough to subscribe to that asset model. So I end up essentially redefining an asset model in 3 or 4 different places. That's really the same thing. So I'm hopeful in the future that collapses.
Is there a role, do you think, for, so this is kind of, we're getting to best practices, and I'm starting to think too about edge and cloud, if we're thinking about scale and data. So how are you thinking about edge and cloud? Is there a role, like what is the role for each? What's the right balance? John P., I'd like to get your input on this because we're with you now, and then Chris too, to rebut the word you mentioned.
So me first, edge versus cloud. One of the, we actually started, maybe right as I was coming in, like a lot of it was like just put it up in the cloud strategy and can make sense of it at the end when you do the use cases. I will say that's one approach, but the downside of that approach is that you're really you'll end up having to find a lot of data engineers and DevOps people at the back end to get the data into a form that's needed to, solve one use case. So really, it's maybe faster sometimes to just get the data up to the cloud, but you're kicking the can down the road in terms of trying to get value out of the data. So that's one piece where I try to, as much as possible, get the data in the form I need before sending it up to the cloud, and as well, even doing some selectivity in terms of what data is going up to the cloud. I'm not necessarily sending, down to the millisecond data for every single tag up to the cloud, with the hope that sometime later I might have a use case to get value out of it.
Chris, how are you thinking about edge versus cloud? And can you give us some context in terms of how UNS fits into this, if at all?
Yeah, so I think the way that I've diced up edge and cloud, actually, it spawned out of one of our challenges, which is IT. So I quickly realized that if we're going to deploy some architecture at different sites, it's far easier to stick our UNS in our cloud. In our case, it's our private cloud, than it is for me to deploy a bunch of virtual machines at different sites. We're not going to be able to scale fast enough to do all 50 some odd sites. And so the approach we've taken is basically going edge to cloud. So you deploy, in our case, we're using Opto22s, and I've posted about this on LinkedIn. We've got HighByte running on Opto22 Groove Epics, and it's doing the thing that it does best, which is ingesting data, connecting to OPC UA endpoints, connecting to SQL databases, modeling that data and then publishing it to our cloud. And that gets around my scalability issue because, the Opto 22 is famously made in the USA, right? I could buy one and get them shipped to a site in 2 days and get it installed, and I don't need to submit some sort of an IT ticket or a VM request or whatever. And then I can deploy that same exact model. I think, the next step would be to have like some sort of a containerization container engine running on that, so I could have all my HighBytes managed kind of centrally, and I could be able to monitor all my applications. But I think that's a direction that Opto is moving in. But yeah, that helps us solve a number of issues.
John Harrington, what's your perspective on this? What operations should you do, edge versus cloud? What's the right balance? What's the value of contextualizing data?
Yeah, great question. And I think I'm going to build off of both what John and Chris said. I've heard the same thing that John has heard and experienced in the past, which is we get on a call with people and they say, we have 750,000 data tags in our factory, and all I need to do is move them to the cloud. And my experience is that that's a team, that's an OT team that had the request, can you just send us your data? And they said, how do we do it? And that it's not solving problems. It ends up creating a lot of expense. It ends up creating a data swamp essentially in the cloud. And it causes more problems later on for the OT team, because they'll then get asked constantly to come into a conference room or a virtual meeting now to explain what all this data is. And because it's unrecognizable to people outside of the OT side of the business. And so I agree 100% with what John said, which is you need to define how you're using the data. And you need to define, in doing that, you're defining the payloads. What is the information that you need? Where can we source that from? As well as the frequency. I often will say to people, there's nearly infinite data, because we can pull data off of industrial devices at millisecond or even sub-millisecond rates if we really need to. So assume that it's infinite. So now let's solve problems and let's put the data wherever it needs to be. So to round back to, where is it? Is it edge to cloud? We're certainly seeing the biggest trend of moving the data to the cloud. People are really enjoying and getting a lot of value out of leveraging the tool sets that are in the cloud and the capabilities that the cloud brings in terms of scalability and in terms of a lot of different analytic and visualization solutions and tool sets. What we're seeing, interestingly, from the cloud vendors is a move to the edge. So both of the major cloud vendors, Azure and AWS, are developing and building out their edge solutions. And it goes back to what Chris was talking about, which is I want to orchestrate in the cloud, but I may want to run workloads and run connectivity and run even analytics and visualization at the edge, at the data center, or in the cloud, depending on who the user is, depending on the latency issues, depending on the frequency issues, depending on what they're doing. So we see it as a continuum, edge to cloud, in terms of where data is sourced and where data is used. But the key is that we're orchestrating. I think, long term, everything will be orchestrated from the cloud. So you'll have the technology in the cloud. It'll be deployed to the edge potentially. Collect the data. Some data will move to the cloud, some data will stay at the edge, some data will start at the cloud and move back down to the edge. We're seeing all of those happening today. And a lot of it is the data needs to satisfy the user, the consumer of the data, and it needs to be where they are. So it's about delivering the data to where the consumer is. Some of those people are working with cloud-based systems and some on-prem based systems. So, we really see a dynamic there, and it varies.
Well, I think the notion of it being a continuum that certainly sticks with me. It's something that I think we're going to see this happening for some time. It's just a matter of when you decide to participate, to what extent, and what that looks like. This also takes us so quickly to the what the future holds section of our conversation, which is followed by Q&A. So I want to remind our audience, please, if you do have questions, we've received a number so far that we will address momentarily. But if you have questions, I encourage you to ask in the chat, and we'll incorporate them to the extent that we have time. So with that, maybe Chris, let's go to you for sort of this future topic, which is what is next for you in your data journey, and kind of what does the future hold if you look at this? You can approach it however you'd like.
Sure. So I don't know, my video appears to have just died too. So I'll do my best to try to get it back, but in the meantime, I can talk through. So for us, like I said, we're really focused on like the first part of our journey, which is connectivity. We are connecting all of our assets, bringing it into a central location, and continue to build out our unified namespace. I think one of the things that I'm also acutely aware of is some of the shortcomings of the unified namespace, which currently namely is lack of access to historical data. So this comes to our scalability issue of what happens when, as Catalent does quite often when we acquire a new site that already has a historian, and how do we bring that into the unified namespace? I'm not going to go back down to the edge and start putting Opta 22s and recontextualizing all that data and information. How do I bring it in and share all those namespaces? Something that John was already talking about too, John Patanian. I've got multiple namespaces, and how do I deal with that? And I've got these new brownfield sites that are coming online with a completely different namespace. So that's, an area that we're kind of actively exploring as well.
Like a different definition for metaverse. Data aggregation. John P., what's your future hold?
I guess I have a couple of different things. One is, I have some advantage of being at an individual plant, so it's really scaling out to other areas, different manufacturing platforms, different areas of the plant, connecting new devices. So scale up that way, as well as scaling up, individual use cases. So I view this as like, for us, it's not like a project, it's like a way of operation. So like on a month-to-month basis, I'm getting new use cases and configuring the system to implement them. Another area that that really I feel is one for development is really the operational support model. Like I'm putting in this system, which really is a complex distributed system. How do I manage to have oversight into all the pieces of it so that I can manage it, and understanding if I'm getting data drops in any individual place where it's happening. So it's really, how do I have the single pane of glass view into my complete data pipeline? That's another area of development, so that it's really minimizing the amount of time that's needed for operational support of this system.
Certainly from my end, these sound like nice things to have, if not need to have. John Harrington, where are we?
I think to us, scalability and maintainability is critical, and that's what Chris and that's what John said. And I always think of those as the high level goals, but you need to be agile and you need to do it at speed. And so those two kind of feed scalability and maintainability. We need to be able to get access to information. And we need to be educated on leveraging information. That's a key piece that's not even technology related, but getting the teams to understand information and how they can use it. And then especially in life sciences, but also in every other business, we need governance. So we need controls of it. We need, in life sciences, they call it validation, but that's really just governance. We need controls. We need to be able to abide by certain rules and approaches to how things change and make sure that we're tracking it. So scalability, maintainability, so that we can deploy these solutions at speed across the enterprise, across the extended enterprise, vendors. In pharmaceutical space, you've got CMOs and CDMOs working with the OEMs, and you have the same thing in automotive. You have tier one and OEMs in different industries. In electronics, they make wide use of contract manufacturing as well. So how can we share data across them? How can we work better together with the primary goal of driving our business in a controlled and governed environment? So those are the things that we're constantly thinking of. Greater scale, because there's greater data and there's greater uses of it. So there's more and more people that want access to it. And business is changing much faster than it did 10, 20, 30 years ago. And if you just look back at the last 5 years, you can see it where we had many different many different shocks to business, and we've had to react to them. And each one of those shocks causes us to change what we want to measure and change what we want to look at in the data. And so we need just very agile systems to do that.
So I love your response here, because coincidentally it actually ties into one of the questions we've received so far, which is, so what you said is about where we want to go, and where you want to go for change management is especially useful to know where you are right now. So the question we have is, how can pharmaceutical companies and their employees measure digital maturity of the organization? So John, I'm thinking maybe this is a good question for you.
Which John? Me?
You, yeah.
Digital maturity. Yeah. So HighByte has created a data ops maturity model, which is, I think we've written some blog posts and some information on it. And it's really thinking about from the journey that John described earlier of just raw data coming off of your automation environment to contextualized data being delivered to end users at scale across the enterprise. What are the different steps there? A lot of people, when they think about maturity, they think in kind of modern day technology, they're thinking analytic maturity. So like, just getting access to the data, and then predictive and prescriptive. And when we think of digital maturity, we think it's kind of the combination of those two. So it's how you can roll out the data at scale across multiple machines, across multiple plants, as well as how sophisticated are you being with that data. And it's the combination of the two that really drives maturity.
We actually have a HighByte specific question. It says, for HighByte or others that have experience, is HighByte a UNS and also an MQTT broker? And then the second part of the question is, connecting automation equipment is straightforward, OPC or MQTT, but does HighByte have capabilities to connect to, for example, MES or cloud software platforms like quality documents, HR, and so forth? Yeah.
So I'll start with that, and then I can hand it off to the others. So HighByte does have connectivity to OPC, to MQTT. It can collect files. It also can connect to SQL databases and REST APIs. And so it's designed very much to be able to merge data. Because one thing that we realized very early on is process data is critical to almost everyone. But process data contextualized is the contextualization of process data is actually in these other transaction systems. So if you're looking to do process measurements like OEE and things like that, the contextualization of that data is in the MES system. If you're looking to do asset maintenance, oftentimes the process data is contextualized by the CMMS system. In many cases, the contextualization of data is also in the quality system if you're doing quality analytics. So there's a lot of different connections to different systems in order to be able to fully contextualize that data for the use case. In terms of UNS, HighByte it can be your UNS. It has the ability to contextualize and structure data. It also has the ability to publish that into an MQTT broker if you'd like to have an MQTT broker based UNS, which is the more, I'll say, the more traditional approach to it. We can also publish that highly contextualized and organized data into a data lake if that's how you'd like to create a data lake that's based on that's unified. Think of the namespace as really just the structure of the data. Unifying it is to standardize it and making it usable. And that unified namespace can be in multiple different forms depending on how you want to work. Certainly there's some trade-offs of the different ones. What we're seeing is on the OT side, we tend to see it in MQTT brokers, and they're very used to and comfortable with streaming data. They just connect to it and subscribe to it. When it's serving the business, they often want it in the cloud. They're putting it in a data lake. That gives them the history that Chris had talked about. So, how can we get access to historical data as well as real-time data? Publishing it up to a data lake and then being able to access it there, as long as the data is unified and in a logical structure, then, in my eyes, that is a unified namespace. And so, thinking about different approaches, we often use the ISA 95 as the hierarchy, as a way of organizing it. The whole point of that is that that's a really logical approach to organizing information for a manufacturing environment. So it allows you to put data at different levels and make it very easy for the teams to find. And I'll turn it over to Chris and John to see if you have other thoughts on UNS. Chris, go ahead.
Plenty of thoughts on UNS, but I think we've covered a decent amount. I will say for digital maturity, we are using something that's pretty standard, at least in biopharmaceutical, which is the Bioforum Operations Group. There's a subdivision called BPIT, and they have basically a digital maturity index, essentially, and it goes from level 1 plant being paper-based to level 5 being predictive. And at each level, there's automation that's implied in predictive capabilities. But what they don't really cover is kind of the data aspects that have to feed up into these to enable these capabilities. So it's more of a high-level goal.
I'll add that, on the digital maturity assessment, one of our sites has done we have a Singapore site that was one of the pilot sites for the SIRI assessment, Smart Industry Readiness Index. I view those as they have freely available documentation that looks at various aspects of your maturity. I think it aligns with the people, process, technology aspects, but I would say at least it's worthwhile looking at their 18 individual pillars, and they have specific questions as to what's a mature state in each of those areas. So even without getting a third-party assessment, it's useful to look at.
So I see that we have more questions than there is time for, which is great. We will follow up with those people. I want to take this, though, now as an opportunity to thank profusely our panelists. Also, everyone here for your time and attention. And it's been a lively discussion, very informative. Hopefully you can see my screen here. We do have a couple follow-up items that we'd encourage you to engage with to learn a little bit more.
I don't think you're sharing.
I'm not sharing. Okay.
No.
And the team here, though, is available to answer any additional questions that you may have not had an opportunity to answer in the chat. I apologize. I'm not seeing my Zoom here. I've lost everything. Exit, minimize video, share screen. Hopefully this is working.
Got it.
It looks like Mo is helping me out.
Yeah. Yeah, and I also, from HighByte's perspective, just want to thank Chris, thank John, and thank you, Ryan, for all of what you've done. This was a great conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.